Imagine you just helped your country win the biggest war it ever fought. You left your farm or your shop, grabbed your musket, and marched off to fight the enemy. You spent months or even years in military camps, eating bad food, sleeping on the ground, watching friends die from bullets and disease. You fought in battles where men screamed and bled and died all around you. You helped capture enemy forts and drive the enemy out of territories they had claimed for over a century. You risked your life again and again. Your family back home struggled without you. Your business suffered. Your crops went unplanted or unharvested. You sacrificed everything because your country needed you. And then, after all that sacrifice, after victory was finally won, your government turned around and said you now had to pay new taxes to cover the cost of the war you just helped them win. That is exactly what Britain did to the American colonists after the French and Indian War, and the colonists were so angry about it that within 12 years, they started a revolution that created a whole new country. The taxes seemed unfair because the colonists had already paid a huge price in blood and treasure to win the war. And now Britain wanted them to pay again in cash. This was not just about money. It was about respect, about fairness, about whether the colonists were partners in the British Empire or just subjects to be used and then billed for the privilege. The French and Indian War started in 1754 and did not end until 1763. Nearly 9 years of fighting that spread from the forests of Pennsylvania all the way to the gates of Quebec City and beyond. The war was basically about who would control North America. France claimed a huge chunk of territory running from Canada down through the Great Lakes and the Ohio Valley all the way to Louisiana and the Gulf of Mexico. Britain had the 13 colonies along the Atlantic coast, and British colonists wanted to expand westward into that Ohio Valley territory that France also claimed. When Virginia sent George Washington, then just a young officer in his early 20s, to tell the French to get out of the Ohio Valley in 1754, the French refused, and fighting started. That local conflict in the wilderness quickly grew into a massive world war, involving most of the major European powers fighting on multiple continents. The American colonists did not sit on the sidelines during this war. They were right in the middle of it from the very beginning. Colonial militias fought alongside British regular army troops in almost every major campaign. At the Battle of Lake George, in 1755, colonial militia, under William Johnson, defeated a French force, one of the few British victories in the early years of the war. Thousands of colonial soldiers participated in the disastrous Braddock expedition in 1755, where General Edward Braddock led British and colonial forces into a French and Indian ambush near Fort Duquesne. Braddock was killed, his army was shattered, and nearly half the force became casualties. The colonists who survived that nightmare march watched their friends die in the forest and barely escaped with their lives. Colonial troops served in the successful capture of Louisbourg in 1758, a massive operation against the strongest French fortress in North America. Colonial soldiers were part of the army that captured Fort Frontenac on Lake Ontario. Colonial forces fought at Fort Ticonderoga, where a French force held off a much larger British and colonial army in 1758, inflicting terrible casualties. The colonial contribution to the war effort went far beyond just sending soldiers to fight. Colonial governments raised money through their own taxes to pay for their militia units. They supplied food, horses, wagons, and equipment. Colonial shipyards built vessels for the Royal Navy. Colonial merchants provided supplies for British and colonial armies operating in North America. Colonial farmers sold grain and meat to feed tens of thousands of soldiers. The war disrupted colonial economies because so many men were away fighting instead of working their farms and businesses. But the colonies kept contributing because they believed this war was necessary to protect their settlements from French attacks and French ally and Indian raids. The colonists saw themselves as doing their patriotic duty, defending British territories in America against French aggression. They were partners with Britain in this war, or at least they thought they were. The human cost to the colonies was significant. Thousands of colonial soldiers died in battle or from disease during the war years. Camp fever, smallpox, and dysentery killed far more soldiers than combat did, as was typical in 18th century warfare. For every colonial soldier who died from a musket ball or a tomahawk, several more died shivering in a tent from disease, far from home, often buried in unmarked graves in the wilderness. Families lost fathers, sons, and brothers. Communities lost men who would never return to plant crops, run businesses, or raise families. The colonial population was much smaller than Britain's, so these losses represented a larger proportional sacrifice. A town of a few hundred people that sent 20 men to the war and got back only 15 had lost a significant chunk of its working-age male population. Those 5 empty chairs at dinner tables, those 5 farms without farmers, those 5 widows and their children. That was the price the colonies paid for British victory. When the war finally ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1763, the results looked like a total victory for Britain and its colonies. France was kicked out of North America entirely, giving up Canada and all its territories east of the Mississippi River to Britain. Spain, which had allied with France late in the war, had to give Florida to Britain. Britain now controlled everything from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River and from the Gulf of Mexico up to the Arctic. The French threat that had hung over the colonies for generations was completely eliminated. No more French soldiers operating from Canada. No more French forts in the Ohio Valley. No more French agents stirring up Indian tribes to attack colonial settlements. The colonists could now expand westward into territories that had been too dangerous to settle while France controlled them. It seemed like a great victory, and the colonists had every reason to celebrate. They had helped win a war that made their lives more secure and opened up opportunities for westward expansion. The future looked bright. Then the tax bills started arriving from London, and the colonists could not believe what they were seeing. Britain decided that the colonies needed to help pay for the war and for the ongoing costs of defending the expanded empire. The British government's logic seemed reasonable from London's perspective. The war had cost Britain about £82 million, an absolutely massive sum of money. Britain's national debt had doubled during the war. The government was now paying over £4.5 million every year just in interest on that debt, which ate up more than half of all tax revenue. Britain was not bankrupt exactly, but it was in serious financial trouble. British taxpayers were already heavily taxed and were complaining loudly about the burden. Meanwhile, British politicians looked at the American colonies and saw people who paid relatively low taxes compared to British citizens in Britain itself, and who had just gained huge benefits from a war that Britain had paid for. It seemed only fair that the colonists should chip in to help pay the bills. But from the colonial perspective, this looked completely different and totally unfair. The colonists felt they had already paid for the war with their blood, their sons, their money, and their sacrifices. They had raised militia units at their own expense. They had paid colonial taxes to support the war effort. They had fought and died in the battles. They had suffered economically while the war disrupted trade and took workers away from productive labor. Now Britain wanted them to pay again? It felt like being charged twice for the same thing, like buying a house and then having the seller come back years later demanding more money. The colonists started to feel like they were being treated not as valued partners in the empire, but as cash cows to be milked whenever Britain needed money. This feeling of disrespect and unfairness was in many ways more important than the actual dollar amounts of the taxes, though the colonists certainly objected to those as well. The Sugar Act of 1764 was Britain's first major attempt to raise revenue from the colonies after the war. This law put duties on sugar, molasses, and other goods imported into the colonies, and more importantly, it set up strict enforcement mechanisms to make sure colonists actually paid these duties instead of smuggling goods as many had done before. The law explicitly stated that its purpose was to raise revenue to help pay for defending the colonies. Royal Navy ships started patrolling the coast to catch smugglers. New admiralty courts were set up where smuggling cases would be tried without juries, and where the judges had a financial incentive to convict because they got a share of any fines collected. Colonial merchants who had been making good money in the molasses trade, often by evading the old customs duties, now faced serious enforcement and real costs. The economic impact was immediate and painful, but the bigger issue was the principle. Previous customs duties had been justified as regulations of trade, ways to manage commerce within the empire, not as taxes to raise revenue. The Sugar Act was different. It openly admitted it was designed to raise money from the colonies. The colonists started asking questions. Who gave Parliament the right to tax them? The colonists had their own elected assemblies in each colony that passed laws and levied taxes for colonial purposes. Those assemblies represented the colonists, but the colonists did not elect anyone to Parliament in London. They had no representatives there. No one in Parliament answered to colonial voters. So how could Parliament claim the right to tax people who had no say in electing Parliament? This was the beginning of the argument about taxation without representation, an argument that would eventually lead to revolution. The Stamp Act of 1765 made things much worse. This law required that many kinds of printed materials in the colonies had to be on special stamped paper or carry a revenue stamp purchased from British authorities. Legal documents needed stamps. Licenses needed stamps. Newspapers needed stamps. Pamphlets needed stamps. Even playing cards needed stamps. The stamps cost anywhere from a few pennies to several pounds, depending on the document. This tax reached into everyday colonial life in a way that customs duties on molasses did not. Every time someone filed a legal document, every time a newspaper was printed, every time someone got a license, there was a tax to be paid. And unlike customs duties, which at least could be argued were related to regulating trade, the Stamp Act was purely and obviously a direct tax for the purpose of raising revenue. There was no way to interpret it as anything else. The colonial reaction to the Stamp Act was explosive and immediate. Riots broke out in Boston, New York, and other cities. Angry crowds attacked the homes of stamp distributors, the officials who were supposed to sell the stamps and collect the tax. These mobs, often calling themselves Sons of Liberty, intimidated stamp distributors so effectively that nearly all of them resigned their positions rather than face violence. Without anyone willing to sell the stamps, the tax could not be collected. Colonial merchants organized boycotts of British goods, refusing to import products from Britain until the Stamp Act was repealed. This put economic pressure on British manufacturers and merchants, who then lobbied Parliament to repeal the tax. Colonial assemblies passed resolutions declaring that Parliament had no right to tax the colonies. The Virginia House of Burgesses, with a young Patrick Henry making fiery speeches, declared that only the Virginia Assembly had the right to tax Virginians. Massachusetts called for a Stamp Act Congress, where representatives from 9 colonies met and issued a declaration of rights and grievances. The argument the colonists made was based on fundamental English constitutional principles, going back to the Magna Carta in 1215 and reinforced by the English Civil War in the 1640s and the Glorious Revolution. In 1688, English constitutional tradition held that taxes required the consent of the people being taxed, given through their representatives. The king could not just impose taxes on his own. Parliament had to approve taxes because Parliament represented the people. This was a core English liberty, one that English people had fought and died to establish. The colonists saw themselves as English people, with all the rights of English people, including this fundamental right that they could only be taxed by their own representatives. They had representatives in their colonial assemblies, so those assemblies could tax them. They had no representatives in Parliament, so Parliament could not tax them. The logic seemed clear and undeniable to the colonists. Parliament's response was to say that the colonists were represented in Parliament through something called virtual representation. The theory was that members of Parliament represented all British subjects everywhere, not just the specific people who voted for them. By this logic, a member of Parliament from London virtually represented colonists in Boston just as much as he represented people in London who could not vote, like women and men who did not own enough property to qualify as voters. The colonists rejected this argument completely. They said virtual representation was nonsense. Real representation meant being able to vote for your representatives, to give them instructions, to hold them accountable, to throw them out if they did not serve your interests. A member of Parliament who never had to face colonial voters, who probably had never even been to America, who answered only to British voters with British interests, could not possibly represent colonists in any meaningful way. The debate over the Stamp Act was not just about money. The actual amounts of tax revenue involved were fairly small. The Stamp Act was expected to raise about £60,000 a year from all the colonies combined. That was a lot of money to individual colonists who had to pay the tax, but it was a tiny fraction of Britain's government budget and its massive war debt. The British government was spending £350,000 a year just to keep troops stationed in America after the war. The £60,000 from the Stamp Act would not even cover a fifth of that cost. So clearly this was not really about whether the specific tax revenue was affordable or reasonable. It was about power and principle. Britain wanted to establish that Parliament had the authority to tax the colonies. The colonists wanted to establish that Parliament did not have that authority. Both sides saw this as a fundamental constitutional question about how the empire would be governed. The Stamp Act was repealed in 1766 because the colonial boycott of British goods was hurting British businesses and because enough members of Parliament were convinced that the tax was causing more trouble than it was worth. But on the same day Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, it also passed the Declaratory Act, which stated that Parliament had full authority to make laws for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Parliament was backing down on the specific tax but asserting its right to tax if it wanted to. The colonists celebrated the repeal of the Stamp Act, but mostly ignored the Declaratory Act, and the fundamental disagreement remained unresolved. Britain claimed the right to tax the colonies. The colonists denied that right. Sooner or later, this conflict would come to a head again. It came to a head again in 1767, with the Townshend Acts, a new series of taxes on goods imported into the colonies, including glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. The man behind these taxes, Charles Townshend, thought he had found a clever solution. He remembered that colonists had objected to the Stamp Act, partly on the grounds that it was an internal tax, a tax on activities within the colonies. So Townshend created external taxes, duties on imports, thinking the colonists would accept those. He was wrong. The colonists recognized that the purpose of these duties was to raise revenue, just like the Stamp Act, and they objected just as strongly. It did not matter whether the tax was technically internal or external. What mattered was whether Parliament had the right to tax them for revenue without their consent, and the colonists said it did not. Making matters worse, the revenue from the Townshend duties was specifically designated to pay the salaries of royal governors and judges in the colonies. Previously, these officials had been paid by the colonial assemblies, which gave the assemblies leverage over them. If a governor did something the assembly really did not like, the assembly could threaten to withhold his salary. Now Britain was trying to make these officials financially independent of the colonial assemblies, which would make them answerable only to Britain, and not to the colonists they governed. The colonists saw this as another attack on their ability to govern themselves. Once again, there were boycotts, protests, and increasingly organized resistance. In Boston, tensions between colonists and British soldiers, sent to maintain order, led to the Boston Massacre in 1770. Where British soldiers fired into a crowd and killed 5 colonists. The Townshend duties, except for the tax on tea, were repealed in 1770, But again, the fundamental issue remained unresolved. The Tea Act of 1773 seemed like it should not have caused trouble because it actually made tea cheaper for colonists. The British East India Company was struggling financially, and Parliament passed a law allowing the company to sell tea directly in the colonies without paying certain duties in Britain. Even with the remaining tax from the Townshend Acts, the company's tea would be cheaper than smuggled tea. Britain expected colonists to happily buy the cheaper tea, but the colonists saw this as a trick, a way to get them to accept Parliament's right to tax them by making the taxed tea so cheap they would buy it. If they bought the tea, they would be implicitly accepting that Parliament could tax them. So in Boston, colonists dressed as Indians boarded ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into the harbor in December 1773, an act of defiance that became known as the Boston Tea Party. Similar acts of resistance occurred in other ports. Britain's response was harsh. Parliament passed what it called the Coercive Acts and what colonists called the Intolerable Acts. These laws closed Boston Harbor until the destroyed tea was paid for, which strangled Boston's economy. They altered the Massachusetts government to reduce self-governance and increase British control. They allowed British officials accused of crimes to be tried in Britain, rather than in Massachusetts, where colonists felt justice would never be done. They expanded requirements for colonists to house British soldiers. These were not tax laws. They were punishment for the Tea Party, and a demonstration that Britain would use its full power to force colonial obedience. But they had the opposite effect. Instead of intimidating the colonies into submission, the Coercive Acts convinced many colonists that Britain intended to destroy all colonial rights and liberties. The other colonies rallied to support Massachusetts. The First Continental Congress met in 1774 to coordinate resistance. By 1775, just 12 years after the end of the French and Indian War, Britain and the American colonies were at war. British troops marching to seize colonial military supplies at Concord clashed with Massachusetts militia at Lexington and Concord in April 1775. The Revolutionary War had begun. The long chain of events from the first post-war taxes to actual revolution showed how a seemingly reasonable British policy, making the colonies help pay for their own defense, had collided with deeply held colonial beliefs about their rights as English people. The colonists felt betrayed. They had fought for Britain in the French and Indian War. They had sacrificed. They had won. And their reward was to be taxed without their consent by a parliament that did not represent them, then punished harshly when they objected. Looking back, it is easy to see how both sides believed they were right, and how the conflict became impossible to resolve peacefully. Britain had spent a fortune winning the French and Indian War, largely for colonial benefit. Britain now had to defend and administer vast new territories in North America. Britain's taxpayers were already heavily burdened. It seemed entirely reasonable to British politicians that the colonies should help pay for the war and for their own defense. The amounts of tax involved were not huge by British standards. British people in Britain paid far more in taxes than colonists did. From London's perspective, the colonists were getting a great deal, enjoying British protection and British markets, while paying relatively little for the privilege. When colonists objected to small taxes and then destroyed property in protests like the Boston Tea Party, it looked like ingratitude and disloyalty. But from the colonial perspective, the situation looked completely different. The colonists had already paid for the war with blood and sacrifice. They had their own local governments that taxed them for local purposes, and they believed those were the only governments with the right to tax them. The Parliament's taxation, without representation, violated fundamental principles that British people had established through revolutions and civil wars. The colonists saw themselves as defending traditional English liberties against a Parliament that was overreaching its authority. They were not asking for special treatment. They were asking for the same rights that English people in England enjoyed. the right not to be taxed without the consent of their own elected representatives. When Britain responded to their protests with more taxes, and then with punitive measures like the Coercive Acts, it confirmed colonial fears that Britain intended to turn them into second-class subjects with no real rights. The tragedy is that this conflict might have been avoided with more wisdom and restraint on both sides, or with a genuine willingness to find a constitutional compromise. Various proposals were suggested over the years. Some people suggested that the colonies should be allowed to elect representatives to Parliament, though the logistics of this would have been difficult, given the distance and communication times involved. Some suggested that Parliament should acknowledge that it could not tax the colonies directly, but that the colonies would voluntarily contribute to imperial expenses through their own assemblies. Some suggested establishing a separate American Parliament that would handle American affairs while remaining connected to Britain through the Crown. None of these proposals gained enough support to be seriously tried. Instead, both sides dug in on their principles, and the conflict escalated step by step from taxes to protests to punishments to more resistance to war. The British government was not willing to admit that Parliament's authority had any limits, because admitting that Parliament could not tax the colonies might call into question Parliament's authority more broadly. The colonists were not willing to accept taxation without representation, because accepting that principle would leave them at the mercy of a legislature that did not represent them and could tax them at will. Neither side would compromise on what it saw as fundamental principles, and so compromise became impossible. War became inevitable, and 8 years of fighting followed. The ultimate irony is almost too perfect. Britain fought the French and Indian War in large part to protect and expand its American colonies. Britain won that war at enormous cost. The debt from that war led Britain to tax the colonies. The taxes provoked resistance based on principle. The resistance led to revolution. The revolution led to American independence. Britain lost the very colonies it had fought so hard and paid so much to protect. The victory in the French and Indian War, which seemed so complete in 1763, led directly to the loss of the 13 colonies just 20 years later. If Britain had never won that war, or if it had won but handled the aftermath differently, the empire might have held together. But Britain won, and then made the fateful decision to tax the colonists who had helped win the victory. And the colonists said no, and neither side would back down, and the result was the United States of America. When Americans today pay taxes, the system is based on principles that came directly from this conflict. The Constitution specifies that all revenue bills must start in the House of Representatives, the branch of government most directly elected by and accountable to the people. This ensures that taxation requires the consent of representatives chosen by those being taxed. No taxation without representation went from being a protest slogan to being fundamental principle of American government. The colonists who resisted British taxes in the 1760s and 1770s established the idea that legitimate government requires the consent of the governed, including consent to be taxed. They were willing to fight a revolution over that principle, and they won. And that principle became built into the foundation of American democracy. So, in a very real sense, every tax form you fill out, every tax dollar you pay, exists within a system shaped by the conflict that started when Britain tried to tax the American colonists for winning the French and Indian War. The colonists said, "You cannot tax us without our consent." And Britain said, "Yes, we can." And the argument could not be settled with words, so it was settled with muskets and cannons, and the colonists won, and America was born.